Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today. Before I do the introduction, I wanted to let everybody know that this event is being recorded. Welcome to this year's Herbert W. Vaughan Memorial Lecture. Wiley Vaughan, as he was known, was a 1948 graduate of the Harvard Law School who passed away in 2011. Mr. Vaughan was a prominent Boston lawyer and the dean of the Boston Real Estate Bar with the Boston firm of Hale and Dorr, which is now Wilmer Hale. He endowed this lecture series, in his words, to promote and advance understanding of the founding principles and core doctrines of American constitutionalism. Mr. Vaughan believed, again in his words, that the Constitution of the United States is the greatest practical achievement of political science and is a testament to the extraordinary gifts of creativity, prudence, and high-mindedness possessed by the founders of our nation. We're honored today to have Peter Berkowitz deliver this year's Vaughan Lecture. Peter is the Tad and Diane Taube Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. If you'll excuse me, I'm actually a little bit indisposed, so I'm going to just say the most important thing about your lectureship, which is that I'm going to skip Peter's many qualifications and just say that he served from 2019 to 2021 as the director of the State Department's Policy Planning Staff, as executive secretary of the Department's Commission on Unalienable Rights, and as the senior advisor to the Secretary of State. I'm sorry that I skipped over his books and other important accomplishments, but please welcome Peter Berkowitz.
Good afternoon. Thanks first to Jack Goldsmith, an old friend who, in my mind at least, really exemplifies what it means to be both a scholar and a gentleman. I also want to say it's an honor to give the Vaughan Lecture. I subscribe to all of Mr. Vaughan's thoughts about the accomplishments of the United States Constitution. And I want to say a special thank you to the intrepid and inimitable Marianne Glendon, who chaired the Commission on Unalienable Rights, the subject of this talk. I suspect that Marianne was the very best person that her former student, Mike Pompeo, could have chosen to head the commission. Partly this is reflected in a couple of books she wrote in particular. Marianne's the author, for the time of many of you in this room, I know, but an important book, early 90s, I think, called Rights Talk. And for this book, Marianne acquired a reputation as a critic of rights. She demonstrated the various ways in which people had a tendency to try to convert their political preferences into rights, a right being something that's objective, universal, necessary. Often in regard to political preferences, they would do this, and this had the result of impoverishing political discourse, because it's one thing to disagree with my opinion, but if I can persuade you or persuade a majority that my opinion is a right, then you're not attacking an opinion anymore. You're attacking something that's universal, objective, and necessary. About a decade later, Marianne published a book called World Made New, which dealt with Eleanor Roosevelt in particular, her work in leading the drafting and ratification of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This book championed rights. How could it be? Marianne is both a critic of rights and a champion of rights. And of course, the answer is that in her earlier book, Marianne had criticized the excesses to which rights can be taken in defense of the proper understanding of rights. And in the subsequent book, she celebrated a great achievement for rights better understood. Also, I should mention another book that she edited called Seedbeds of Virtue. This is from the late 1980s, which makes a point, or combined with these other two books, makes a point that was central to the work of the Commission on Unalienable Rights. and that is, it's a big mistake to speak about rights separate from other political goods, duty and responsibility, community, the virtues. Especially in the academic world, we have a tendency to be invited to take sides. Are you a virtue theorist? Are you a communitarian? Do you believe in duty? Are you a rights person? This is a terribly unsound way of thinking about political life. To defend rights properly, we have to give due attention to the virtues, to the duties, community, and more. So thank you, Marianne, for your extraordinary leadership of the Commission on Unalienable Rights. Jack mentioned I served as head of the policy planning staff in July 2019. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo asked me to take over that role. At the time, I had been a part-time member of the policy planning staff. He had already announced the creation of the Commission on Unalienable Rights. This, by the way, was an independent commission under federal guidelines, but it was to be housed within the policy planning staff. That meant that I inherited the role of executive secretary. That means I was given the opportunity to work alongside Marianne on the commission, and it was a great honor. Secretary Pompeo had made clear what the purpose of the commission was. The purpose was to offer advice to the Secretary and others about America's undoubted commitment to human rights and foreign policy in light of America's founding principles, constitutional traditions, and the obligations that the United States took on in 1948 when we joined with 47 other nations at the United Nations to vote approval of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What's not to like with such an undertaking? Turns out there was a lot not to like with such an undertaking. We were, the commission, which hardly had existed for a few weeks, was subject to ferocious, vehement criticism from what I think it's fair to call representatives of the human rights establishment. And yet, a year and a half later or so, our report had been endorsed by, unreservedly embraced by, leaders of the world's largest independent Muslim organization, Nahdlatul Ulama, headquartered in Jakarta in Indonesia, and also had been endorsed by Centrist Democrat International, which is an umbrella organization for Christian democratic parties from Europe, from South America, from Africa, and from Asia. How could it be that a report that attracted so much angry criticism, yet nevertheless won support from around the world, from Christians around the world, and the largest independent Muslim organization? Therein lies a tale. I'll be able to tell you about some of it. Let me begin, though, with 3 vignettes that capture something of the environment in which we proceeded. First vignette takes place in September 2019. I've now been head of the policy planning staff for a month or so, and I'm on my 4th or 5th visit to Capitol Hill, where I've been invited, that is to say summoned, by various groupings of Democratic staffers in the House of Representatives, in the Senate. But this time, it's a small meeting in an office of a representative. There were 3 other representatives when I first arrived. The ostensible purpose was for me to answer their questions about the purpose of the Commission on Unalienable Rights. The real purpose of this meeting was for them to denounce me and in no uncertain terms, the Secretary of State for daring to use taxpayer money to address these very important questions. About midway through the meeting, a congressman showed up who had some background in the human rights world. We're sitting at a long, narrow table. And he sat down right in front of me. This was before the days of the pandemic, 6 months before the pandemic. He couldn't have been more than 2.5, 3 feet away from me. And he launched right into the conversation. And he said something like this: "You," in this tone, you and your Secretary of State, you have no idea what damage you are doing with this commission. In truth, I had no idea what damage we were doing with this commission. He could see the puzzlement, I suppose, in my face, so he continued, you and your Secretary of State, you have no idea how you're playing into the hands of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. By looking at America's own national traditions, you're inviting them to look at their own traditions to justify their policy." So I thought to myself, this is not right. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin need no help from the Commission on Unalienable Rights to trample on the rights of their population. None whatsoever. Second, I thought to myself, this is not fair. This is condescending. Why would this congressman believe that turning to the Russian tradition or turning to the great tradition of Confucian civilization would provide nothing but contempt for human rights? He was obviously unfamiliar with these traditions. Like all great traditions, there are a diversity of moral, philosophical, theological resources in them. But instead I said, surely, Congressman, you're familiar with the 1948 UNESCO Symposium, Human Rights, Comments and Interpretations, and its significance. He looked at me blankly. I said, well, it's highly relevant. You know, you'll recall that in advance of the approval of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UNESCO commissioned a symposium. They brought together thinkers from all around the world, a lot of thinkers from the West. There were representatives of the Hindu tradition, representatives of the Muslim tradition, representatives of the Confucian tradition. And all of them were asked whether it was even feasible to come up with a short document of principles that peoples and nations from around the world could agree to. Keep in mind, it had never been done before. Why would you think it's possible? We're so different, aren't we? I went on, said, surely you recall the extraordinary introduction written by French Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain, in which he summarized the results of this symposium. By the way, it's available online. It's about 250 pages. Most of the contributions are in the range of 4 to 8 pages. In some ways it's dated, of course. It's from 1948. In other ways, it's quite timely. Maritain summarized the results as follows. It is reasonable to hope that peoples and nations from around the world can agree on a small core of principles, actions that no government should be permitted to take: torture, arbitrary detention and arrest, and also some actions, some obligations that all governments should be expected to perform, say, prevent any citizens from falling below a certain material minimum. However, wrote Maritain, it was unreasonable to hope that the peoples and the nations of the world would agree to the same arguments, would begin from the same premises, use the same kinds of reasoning to get to agreement about these principles. Instead, it was to be hoped that the different peoples and nations of the world would look to their own traditions, their own culture, their own civilization, and find within the moral resources, the philosophical resources, the religious resources to justify this core set of principles. The congressman was none too happy with my extended reply. He became especially unhappy when I concluded by saying that, so you see, the Commission on Unalienable Rights, the mandate that Secretary Pompeo has given us to look to American traditions, to ground America's commitment to human rights, we are not only not inconsistent with the great post-World War II human rights tradition, we are exemplary of what it was hoped for from those who produced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that it was our hope, I said, that other nations would take our lead. If looks could kill, I would have been a dead man. Let's just say that our meeting ended shortly after that. Second vignette. So that was September 2019. It's now about a year later, September 2020. Our report was issued, and a draft was issued in July 2020, the final report in August 2020. In late August, early September, I received an email from a former student, but I've been around long enough so that I have former students who are very accomplished men and women these days. This former student is named Tim Shaw. He was living in India at the time, and he was working to defend religious liberty in India and in Indonesia. And he wrote to me to say that he was working with this group, Nahdlatul Ulama, that his friends affiliated with Nahdlatul Ulama greatly admired the report, and they would like to invite Marianne Glendon and me to come to Jakarta to present the report and engage in conversations about cross-civilizational understanding. I wrote back immediately, said, terrific, I'll speak to Marianne. By the way, this is September 2020. In the midst of the pandemic, I wondered whether Marianne would be up for a trip to Jakarta. This is a bit of a diversion from the story. I'll just say that when I called up Marianne and began to tell the story and got to the invitation part, she exclaimed, "You bet, I'm in." In any case, but before I had a chance to mention this to Marianne, 30 minutes after I received the email and replied to it, saying I'll talk to Marianne, I had a meeting with the Secretary of State. For our meetings, it was customary for me to bring him a list of problems. We go through the problems. In this case, there were about 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sir, what would you like to do about this? We've got a fire over here. How would you like to handle it? Nobody's paying attention to this matter. I think you need to. 1 through 6, nothing but problems. As I'm getting up to go, it occurred to me that I should present some good news. Why not? So I very quickly told Secretary Pompeo about this email, and I should have mentioned, the report was obviously very important to Secretary Pompeo. He was delighted to hear it. I told him about the invitation which Marianne and I had received, and his immediate reaction was, terrific, when do we go? We? Yeah. He took up his big leaf of papers with his schedule. He said, I'm going to be in the area in late October. The area turned out to be New Delhi, which is not really in the area of Jakarta, although it is closer than Washington, as his beleaguered executive secretary told me. In any case, Secretary Pompeo did travel. Marianne did as well, and did present the report. And about a month after his trip, he received a letter from Pak Yahya, who was again a high official connected with Nahdlatul Ulama, in which Pak Yahya said that his organization unreservedly embrace the report. Third vignette. A few months later, March 2021, new Secretary of State Antony Blinken makes good on a statement that he offered to the Senate at his confirmation hearing and repudiated the report of the Commission on Unalienable Rights. To make clear how he felt about it, he emphasized that he decisively repudiated the report. Why did he decisively repudiate the report? Because according to Secretary Blinken, the report was unbalanced. In what ways was the report unbalanced? Well, he said, human rights are actually universal. We insist on every page of the report that human rights are universal. Secretary Blinken said, by the way, in a formal statement, you can find this online, Secretary Blinken said it's unbalanced because human rights are interdependent. We had argued that human rights are interdependent. Our report was unbalanced because in reality, human rights are in crisis in all regions of the world. We begin our report with the crisis to which human rights are subject in every region of the world. Our report was unbalanced because in reality, China represents a great threat to human rights, the world's most egregious violator of human rights. We had insisted on as such in our report. Why was our report unbalanced? Because, apparently unbeknownst to us on the Commission on Unalienable Rights, authoritarian states around the world are using high-tech means to monitor and harass their populations, a point we stressed in the final chapter of our report. Our report was unbalanced, according to Secretary Blinken, because in reality, nation states that protect human rights tend to be more peaceful, more prosperous, and stable, a point we make throughout our report. And finally, our report was unbalanced because the United States has an obligation to continue to champion human rights, notwithstanding the defects and shortcomings of liberal democracy in America, a point that we emphasized from the very beginning of our report to our concluding observations. This creates a puzzle. How is it possible that a commission that begins with vehement criticism, I'm going to say more about that criticism, then garners enthusiastic support from a group representing 90 million Muslims on the other side of the globe, from Christian Democrats in Europe, South America, Africa, and Asia, should be repudiated and decisively repudiated by the Secretary of State, despite the fact that every feature of human rights that Secretary Blinken wished to underscore was underscored by our report. It could give you the impression that the critics of our commission are undoubtedly intelligent people. They come from all sorts of elite backgrounds and leading universities, even this one. It gives you the impression that they couldn't possibly have read the report, which already tells you something quite worrisome about the culture of human rights discourse today. So, 3 vignettes. Let me now quickly walk you through the report and restate some of the background. I already alluded to this. It was July 2019 that Secretary Pompeo launched the report with an op-ed that appeared in the Wall Street Journal. Again, he laid out the mandate. The mandate was offer advice about human rights in American foreign policy, but grounded in America's founding principles, constitutional traditions, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. By the way, this was not only, as I've already indicated, was this entirely consistent with the approach adopted by those who drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It makes sense on the American political tradition because the United States was actually founded in dedication to unalienable rights. And what is an unalienable right? A right that is yours just because you're a person, just because you're a human being. In other words, and there are plenty of philosophical niceties and difficulties to discuss here, but a bottom line is an unalienable right, it's fair to say, is an 18th century way of speaking of what we mean by a human right. Okay, well, within 2 weeks, and this might be unprecedented, this independent commission created under the Federal Advisory Committee Act prompted a letter, an open letter, also still online, from a variety of members of the foreign policy establishment and journalism and NGOs and scholars, all members of good standing, again, of the human rights establishment, demanding that Secretary Pompeo immediately dismantle the commission and use the funds that were going to support it for something constructive that would advance America's interests. By the way, I heard this a lot in Congress too. We should use these funds for something constructive. Nobody ever bothered to ask what the commission's budget was, but I can tell you, I think. Yeah, I can tell you. It's public knowledge. First, the State Department's budget in 2019-2020 was in the neighborhood of $52 billion. The budget of the Commission on Unalienable Rights was in the neighborhood of $250,000. Check my math, but $250,000 is on the order of 0.0005% of the State Department's annual budget. Too small even to be a rounding error. In addition to this letter, open letter, 250 signatories, also Robin Wright in the New Yorker, Ken Roth in the Washington Post, Roger Cohen in the New York Times, also published scathing criticisms, arguing, like the congressman would a couple months later, that we were going to do terrible damage to America's interests. By the way, it's now 2022. I'm curious what damage our critics believe that, in retrospect, we have done. In any case, what were their criticisms? Let's go through them. These are some of the standard criticisms of the Commission on Unalienable Rights. First, the Trump administration was unfit to touch the precious subject of human rights. Why was that? Well, it was never fully explained. We can all acknowledge that the president issued countless mean tweets. But if we look at Trump administration foreign policy, Trump administration had increased sanctions on human rights violator Russia, had increased sanctions even more on human rights violator Iran, had sought negotiations with human rights violator North Korea to prevent it from pursuing more nuclear weapons, had been working on a peace plan for Israelis and Palestinians and laid the groundwork, it turns out, for what would be the biggest advance in the Middle East in decades, the normalization of relations between Israel initially with Bahrain and Emirates. Morocco joined and a number of other countries joined. So it was not clear why unfit. A second point is that we're an independent commission. And a third point, a third reply is, why wouldn't you think this is a good thing? How unexpectedly that the Secretary of State appointed by Donald J. Trump has seen fit to create an independent commission. And after all, human rights belong to all peoples and all nations. It can't be that there's just one subgroup within the United States to whom human rights are off limits. Why not encourage that? A second criticism. The critics early on said that there was something sinister in Secretary Pompeo's distinction. This is from his July 2019 op-ed. Something sinister in his distinction between unalienable rights and ad hoc rights created by government. Actually, there's nothing sinister at all. This distinction is absolutely essential to thinking about human rights in government. What are positive laws, ad hoc laws, laws created by governments in the United States? We hope and expect that the laws created by our government, our Constitution, first of all, the laws created under the Constitution, but they're created by us, human beings, will serve the interest of human rights, will instantiate those promises in the concrete realities of political life. Third, critics complained that the Commission on Unalienable Rights mandate was superfluous. All the debates had been settled, they said, and this was shown in the adoption of a number of international human rights treaties which had codified human rights treaties. We know what they are through the positive law of international human rights. But this also was based on a misunderstanding. First of all, the ferocious reaction to the Commission on Unalienable Rights showed that there were debates aplenty still. But second, a right does not become inalienable because it gets codified into an international treaty. In fact, an inalienable right, our notions of inalienable rights are standards, common standards that stand above positive law, and a treaty is positive law, and help us judge it. Fourth, many people argued that the real purpose of the Commission was to strip various groups, women especially, LGBTQ, and others, of their rights. This was nonsense. It's true that the report does not deal specifically with women's rights or LGBTQ and others' rights. It's also true that we don't deal with long-haired people's rights or freckled-faced people's rights. But we deal with rights that are shared by long-haired people, freckled-faced people, women, LGBTQ, and others, because our subject is human rights. Again, the rights that are inherent in all persons just because they're persons. Here's another criticism of the report. It was said that our commission was monolithic, composed of nothing but conformist, like-minded people. This too is absurd, but I won't answer this by reporting on our internal deliberations, because that would betray confidences. I'll just stay on the surface. Who was on our commission? There were Republicans, there were independents, there were Democrats, there were Jews, there were Christians, there were Muslims, there was a Mormon, there were specialists in international law, constitutional law, American constitutional government, political philosophy, comparative literature, sociology, African American studies. There were scholars, there were activists. There were people from government, there were people outside of government. Actually, I would say that the intellectual diversity on the commission compared quite favorably with the lack thereof of our critics. Compare the intellectual diversity of the 250 signatories to that open letter I mentioned. And to tell you the truth, the intellectual diversity of the Commission on Unalienable Rights compares very favorably with the faculty at Harvard Law School. Sixth, the commission was charged with having unjustifiably elevated the claims of religious liberty. This was a strange criticism for a couple of reasons. First, we actually reported accurately that religious liberty was regarded as an inalienable right at the founding era. It's the first freedom protected by the Bill of Rights. Here's another reason it's a strange criticism. There is a high correlation between countries that protect religious liberty and countries that protect the other basic rights and fundamental freedoms. Perform the thought experiment. Can you think of a country, there are not many, that fully protects religious liberty that doesn't protect basic rights and fundamental freedoms? Alternatively, can you think of a country that denies religious liberty but still protects basic rights and fundamental freedoms? It's not easy to make a long list. We were also charged with elevating property rights. This was after the report. The one new criticism that came out after the report. This is a strange criticism as well. First of all, we don't elevate it. We report, consistent with our mandate, that the founders of the United States regarded property rights as inalienable rights. But we also pointed out that on the 18th century understanding, one has a property right in one's rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So to elevate property rights in the spirit of the founders is to elevate unalienable rights, which is to elevate human rights. So this criticism amounts to, you are guilty in the report of the Commission on Unalienable Rights for elevating human rights, a nonsensical criticism. Time is running short, and I'm very eager to deal with questions, so I will make the rest of my summary of the report brief. The initial criticisms of our report seem not to hold water, and we dealt with those in real time. The Commission held 6 public meetings from October 2019 through the pandemic into July 2016. Secretary Pompeo presented the report to the world in July 2016 in Philadelphia. The report has 5 sections. The first section, an introduction, deals with the myriad controversies that swirl around human rights themselves. Our critics were wrong. The debate isn't settled. In fact, human rights, as actually Secretary Blinken himself pointed out in repudiating our report, are in crisis around the world. One can find in any great university people attacking the idea of the Human Rights Project from the left, saying that it's a vehicle for spreading Western imperialism and colonialism. Not in universities, but you can find serious conservatives outside universities who complain that the Human Rights Project is actually an effort to promote a progressive political agenda under a sham universality. There are other complaints and other controversies swirling around human rights, some having to do with the emergence of a human rights bureaucracy or industry, which, like every bureaucracy, has acquired special interests which it promotes at the expense of the purposes for which it was created. We discuss more such controversies around human rights, and we argue that it's especially important for a country like the United States, which is grounded in its commitment to the rights that adhere in all persons, to address these controversies head on, to restate our commitments and convictions. So this is what we attempted to do in the report. In part 2 of the report, we offer a restatement of America's distinctive and dynamic human rights tradition, national tradition. We emphasize that what we think of as the American tradition is actually represents the coming together of at least 3 great traditions, arguably more, but 3 great traditions. In America, you see at the founding the convergence of the biblical tradition and the beautiful biblical teaching about equality, that all human beings are created b'tselem Elohim, in God's image. The Bible says, male and female, he created them. That suggests, you can think of this as a modern way of restating this, that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. but it also means that we all have some responsibilities, one for the other. That's one tradition, the biblical or religious tradition. Another tradition was the tradition of civic republicanism. It goes back to classical Rome, which teaches the freedom of the citizens depends upon a certain public spiritedness and virtue to maintain free institutions. And the final tradition is the modern tradition of freedom, a seminal statement of which was John Locke's second treatise, which explains what it means for human beings to be by nature free and equal, and what kind of government is suited to such human beings. And the answer is a limited government. So in part two, I'll just state this very quickly, we show, first, what is entailed by the Declaration of Independence. And by the way, we do not deny, we do not sugarcoat the pact that the founders made with the evil institution of slavery at the founding in 1776, in 1787 with the drafting of the Constitution, 1788 with the ratification of the Constitution. But we do insist that the evil institution of slavery is obscenely inconsistent with America's founding principles. And second, we show how America's founding principles provide inspiration for reformers throughout American tradition, from Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the Declaration of Sentiments in 1948, behalf of women's rights, through Frederick Douglass in the 1850s on behalf of slaves, through Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg, all the way through Martin Luther King. And by the way, I would suggest if you really press even on the most radical statements today, denouncing the American tradition today, which is actually not so novel as the denouncers think, because it echoes the language of William Lloyd Garrison from the 1840s and 1850s, an abolitionist. But never mind, if you press, however much you may disagree with those critics who say that America was born in a commitment to racism, at the end of the day, what are they arguing for? It's not monarchy. It's not aristocracy. And however much they may be wishing to adopt authoritarian means on the way to their goal, if you press them on their goal, they have a hard time escaping the language of freedom, the language of rights. We also in the report, contrary to our critics, emphasize that the social and economic rights, which probably begin to develop in this country in the 19th century, which blossom with FDR, the Four Freedoms, the New Deal, are not a betrayal of Americans' founding principles, but an application of those founding principles to new circumstances when Americans are moving out of the countryside into the city, in which the extended family is shrinking, becoming a nuclear family. When individuals are thrown out more on their own to defend for themselves, the state takes up more responsibility for ensuring basic minimums, so that, and this is the best justification within the American system for social and economic rights, to ensure that all citizens have a basic material minimum so that they're in a position to enjoy their rights. Because time is running short, I will just say at this point that in the next part of our report, we look very closely at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We regard it as an extraordinary achievement. We think that its strength in significant measure grows out of its commitment to austerity, to identifying, as Maritain wrote about, a small set of core principles which increases the likelihood that peoples and nations from around the world can sign up to it, can recognize their own deepest commitments. The more you multiply claims about human rights, the more you make agreement for peoples and nations around the world difficult. In the report, we summarize some more of the achievements. We identify a number of perplexities that still swirl around the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Here, and again, because I need to end, I want to insist on 2 points. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is like the Declaration of Independence. It doesn't provide causes of action in a court of law. It wasn't intended to. It was intended to articulate a common standard of achievement for peoples and nations around the world. To do what? What does the Universal Declaration of Human Rights emphasize? It emphasizes that in light of the principles laid out here, individuals and nations should strive through teaching and education to promote respect for these principles. In other words, it's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that draws a strong connection between the defense of human rights, between their recognition and the observance, and education. Yes, of course, international institutions are important. Yes, of course, impartial tribunals. Yes, of course, treaties. But all of these will be mere formalities without a proper education that teaches about the nature, the scope of human rights, and how they are deeply rooted in one's own tradition. So, I will end here with next steps. What is to be done? There's a lot to be done, but especially people who are at universities, it seems to me, can take the lead in teaching and education for many other reasons, but not least for the sake of promoting, through teaching and education, respect for human rights. I would reform the undergraduate curriculum so that all students are given a serious acquaintance with America's founding principles and constitutional traditions. I would reform the law school curriculum so all law students are given, as a mandatory matter, a clear acquaintance with the various traditions that feed into the American constitutional tradition. And here's my final suggestion. 2023 will be the 75th year anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Wouldn't it be fitting for some distinguished institution of higher education in the law to convene a symposium like the one that UNESCO convened in 1947 to revisit the question, bringing people from all over the world, the peoples and the nations of the world, short essays, 4 to 8 pages, addressing the question 75 years later, is it reasonable for peoples and nations from around the world to agree on a small core set of principles? And was Mary Taine right? That it's unreasonable to expect we'll agree on the arguments, but reasonable for the different peoples and the different nations to look to their own traditions for the moral, philosophical, religious resources. And by the way, if you know any institutions interested in that, I've got just the person to lead it. Yes, the intrepid and inimitable Mary Ann Glendon. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Goldsmith, and thank you so much for coming in. I was wondering, you brought up, of course, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and I'm wondering, when we're interpreting constitutional text like the freedom of speech, what bearing should the words of the Declaration or the preamble to the Constitution have on our construction of the meaning of those terms?
I think they should have a bearing. My own view is that it's important to understand that the very purpose of the Constitution, one of its leading purposes, let's say, is to secure our rights, our unalienable rights. As the Declaration says, as you know, after it speaks about these unalienable rights, it puts forward as another self-evident truth that governments are instituted among men to secure these rights. So I would always keep in mind the purpose for which the purposes for which the Constitution was designed. And I think this is really not so far off from a traditional understanding that in interpreting the Constitution, we pay attention to text, structure, history, and part of that history, and part of the original understanding, the public meaning would have been this understanding of the Declaration and unalienable rights.
Thank you. I was just wondering, we talked briefly about social and economic rights as sort of positive rights. Where, how do you draw the line on, some of this is defensible, but maybe some goes too far, and as you mentioned, you can't make a whole book of rights if you want them all to be defended. So how do you do that sort of resource management?
A point that the Commission emphasizes on social and economic rights, and this is following an argument that you can see in Marianne's book on the subject, is that while all the rights that are laid out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are, we know from the Vienna Declaration, are to be treated as universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated, there are distinctions among the rights, and those distinctions are incorporated into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So let's say the first 21 articles are couched in terms of everyone shall have a right to, no one shall be subject to. They're couched in categorical terms. And these rights, I should have mentioned, they cover familiar civil and political rights. They echo the Declaration of Independence, the American Bill of Rights, First 10 Amendments, and the protections that were incorporated into the Constitution for persons with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Those are treated as categorical. When the social and economic rights are introduced in Article 22, the language shifts. Social and economic rights, we're told, are necessarily a function of political systems, of political culture, of economic circumstances of different states. We should recognize they will be implemented in different ways. They're more qualified. States, countries still have an obligation. We took on the obligation. In the United States, we tend to think of social and economic rights as matters dealt with by legislation. To the extent they're dealt with by legislation, we expect this to be a matter of democratic debate. Some people want a wider safety net. Some people think it would be more appropriate to have a narrow safety net. Some people are worrying about dependency. Other people are worrying that we're not generous enough. These will necessarily be matters of democratic debate, and you shouldn't expect here, on lots of the vexing issues, there will be some matters appropriate for judges, but in lots of circumstances, the determination of the scope, heaviness of the social safety net is properly left to the differences among states and democratic debate.
Yes, thank you. I have a question kind of about that framing you were talking about
Please.
This difference between categorical rights that you could say were inalienable at the founding and in the understanding of the founding generation versus what we might consider to be more rights today that you might consider to be kind of positive law add-ons. I kind of wonder, though, time has upset many fighting faiths, and what we consider to be inalienable and who we consider, deserving of fundamental protection, not just protection through positive law, can update. How does that understanding of how social meaning can really change and how rights protection can really evolve kind of work its way into the Commission's work?
I think the Commission fully recognizes, if I'm understanding the point you're making. But let's start with the rights that were treated as unalienable. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think they're still we are right to regard them as unalienable. And when we think about the elaboration of constitutional rights, I think it's good to think in those terms. So, and there are a couple of different issues here, and so there are many faculty members who here at Harvard who have thought very subtly about this matter. And I'm not sure this is your point, but of course, as times change, we come to a different understanding of the application, just of laws, but of unalienable rights. Now, at the time of the founding, there were plenty of people who recognized that that the institution of slavery was absolutely inconsistent with the idea of unalienable rights. And there were women who understood that unalienable rights included them, starting with Abigail Adams. It took time within the United States for majorities to recognize this and recognize that these protections apply to all persons, and we still have plenty of work to do. So on the domestic front, I don't see I don't see any need to alter the fundamental understanding of unalienable rights, but of course there's been a continuing need in the United States to make reforms as we absorb the notion that this group of people or that group of people has been deprived of rights that are theirs by virtue of being a human person. Having said that, I also want to make a point that we make in the report concerning adding to human rights on the international scene. As you know, there's been a proliferation of human rights treaties. The United States hasn't signed on to all of them. Some of them it's signed on to. It has announced its reservations here or there. We fully recognize that in the report that the UDHR is a human document. It may have left something out, but there are well-established mechanisms for adding to this essentially austere document. For example, in the American constitutional tradition, an addition to human rights, a recognition of a new human right as opposed to a new application of an old right, should go through the proper mechanisms of government. We in the United States should also be aware of the fact that you can do damage to human rights if you insist that X is a human right when many peoples and many nations around the world won't regard it as such. Now, I agree here, you have to be careful there. It's one thing for Xi Jinping to say, we don't recognize these fundamentally democratic protections and rights. It's another thing for a fellow democracy that's committed to rights to say this goes too far. So I'll end by saying, yes, of course, our understandings evolve, circumstances change. There's always a challenge of thinking about, of the challenge of reforming our system in light of the old principles, and the work is not done. We have work still to do. Thanks, Jack. Thank you all.